So in the last 12 hours, Sony announced the ZV-E10 Mark II. Look at it, she's a beauty. I'm kidding, this is a ZV-E1. I wasn't part of the embargo with Sony. But what I will be talking about today is the key differences, in my opinion, between the ZV-E1 and the ZV-E10 Mark II. Obviously, there are going to be differences on paper. So what I will do to save me having to label out the specs one by one, I'm going to put the specs for the ZV-E1 here and the ZV-E10 Mark II here. So you can pause at any time and determine on paper which one looks better to you. It's to each their own, whatever your use case scenario is or budget is. And talking about budget, because that is one of the most important factors a lot of us creators, photographers, videographers go in with as a primary focus for the most part, obviously specs being the close second. The price at this time of recording for this full frame equivalent, the ZV-E1, is $2,878, whereas with the newly announced ZV-E10 Mark II is $1,849, according to my notes. And if you were to pair it with the newly announced 16 to 50 f3.5 to 5.6 OSS Mark II lens, it'd be about $2,000. So it's a pretty decent price, I'm not gonna lie, but for that price, you are making sacrifices to the specs, which you can see on either side of me. So I'm just gonna go through some key differences, in my opinion. Again, this is what it is on paper, but my experience of why I would choose the ZV-E1 over the ZV-E10 Mark II, and I'd save up my pennies so I can get this camera. So this camera was announced last year, May 2023. So it was released in Australia mid-year. At this time, you can buy this secondhand. People are selling it for various reasons, and I was able to pick this up secondhand, fortunately in great condition for a great price. So that is an option there. You don't have to spend the extra $1,000 difference between the two. You can pick this up for, say, $500, $600 more. So that's great to pick up a full frame camera with all the full frame capabilities and the differences between the two. One of the key differences, one of the biggest things why I would choose this camera here, the ZV-E1, is its low light performance. Because it is a full frame sensor and because it shares a sensor, the same sensor as the FX30 and the A7S3, it has a dual native ISO of 640 and 12,800, whereas the ZV-E10 Mark II shares the same sensor as the FX30, which I'm recording this video on, and the A6700. So it has a dual native ISO of 800 and 2,500. So essentially, this thing can see in the dark. And yes, the ZV-E10 Mark II has nice dual native ISO for its size, the APS-C crop sensor, but you'll need very fast lenses to be able to use that in very dark scenarios. Whereas if I were to use a very fast aperture lens on this camera, I will be less pressured to use external lighting, which you should anyway, but I just find this is easier to run and gun. And that brings me to my next point, the differences between the two, which you can see on either side of me, of course, but the active stabilization that both of these cameras share, but there's different crops for both of them. So with the ZV-E1, you have a 1.1 times crop with the active stabilization and a 1.33 times crop with the dynamic stabilization, whereas with the ZV-E10 Mark II, you have a 1.33 times crop with the active stabilization. There is no dynamic stabilization, unfortunately. And not only that, there's no IBIS inbuilt to the ZV-E10 Mark II, whereas with this one, there is IBIS inbuilt. So you can pair this with any of the OSS lenses and get great stabilization, because one of the biggest reasons I'm comparing these two cameras are they're vlogging cameras. A lot of the videos that have been released within the last 12 hours are loosely comparing it between the A6700 and the FX30 because they are the APS-C crop sensor cameras. But I wanted to compare the two vlog cameras because for their intended purpose of vlogging for the most part. That wasn't really the reason I got this camera, but I use it for vlogging. But you're going to be using it walking and talking, running and gunning. So you want the ability to stabilize in footage because in my experience, stabilizing in post can be a bit of a headache. You want to make sure that you get the best footage in camera every time if you can. So being that this one is going to be more reliable with stabilization, you have less of a crop, you have less issues with the lens selection that you may already have. But being that this has only active stabilization, already has a crop of 1.5 times with the APS-C sensor, as well as a 1.33 times crop with the active stabilization. You're going to need a very wide lens to be able to use that vlogging, or at least walking and talking, or at least an extendable arm like a Joby tripod or Gorilla Pod, whatever they're called. Can't remember. So there are similarities though between the body of this ZV-E1 and the ZV-E10 Mark II. They now share the same full battery. I believe it is the MP-FZ100 battery, which is a very popular battery. It's used on most of Sony cameras. They're great because they last quite a long time for the most part. But with the original ZV-E10, the Mark I version, I think it was the smaller battery. It shares a lot of the same buttons and layout as this camera here. Shares the same 3-inch vari-angle screen, which is 1.037 million dots. It isn't fantastic, but it gets the job done. It shares the same 3 capsule mic up top, and you get this little troll hair to block out wind with the ZV-E10 Mark II as well. You get the power zoom toggle up top there, but from what I have seen, it is more of a compact body, so there are more risks for overheating. In my experience, I've not yet made this overheat. I use this in Bali. I use this for extended periods of time, vlogging for some of my YouTube videos. I've not had an issue once, but that's because I'm shooting in 4K 25, which is the power equivalent to 4K 24. So I'm not really shooting at 4K 50 or 4K 100 unless the situation calls for it. And they're usually very slow, well, very small clips because you're slowing down the footage. So they're going to be 5 seconds, between 5 seconds and 30 seconds in my experience. I don't know anyone who's shooting for long extended periods of time at 4K 50 or 4K 60. So people are saying that this overheats, are in tests that they are using those settings for extended periods of time. And fair enough, do those tests so we know what to expect. But I will say I've not been able to make this camera overheat yet. It did get hot on me in Bali because you're in a humid climate, and I did have it on for a lot of the time. But when you're vlogging, when you're using a run and gun scenario, you're usually shooting, switching off, or shooting and putting it into standby. You find a way to make it work, and I've, like I said, never had an issue. But being that they are similar style cameras, there is that risk. There is that risk of overheating. Now, the reason why I got the FX30 over the A7CR, which would compare very nicely to this camera on my right here, or left to you, I chose the FX30 because it's inbuilt fan. Now, none of these cameras, the ZV-E1, ZV-E10 Mark II, or the 6700 have inbuilt fans. So that's just something to consider. So I'm not going to compare the ZV-E10 Mark II to the FX30 because I got it for different reasons. So this wasn't going to be a very long video. I just really wanted to outline on either side of me the differences and why you should perhaps choose the ZV-E1 over the ZV-E10 Mark II. Yes, there is a price difference, but it's not as substantial as, say, for example, the FX30 to the FX3. So at the time of recording, the FX30 is about $2,000, $2,400. Again, you can pick this camera up secondhand for around $2,000, which I was able to do. A lot of cameras secondhand. Unfortunately, hasn't bit me in the backside yet. But you can also get the FX3 secondhand, but you're going to be paying around $4,900 to $5,400, give or take. So that's double the price, at least. Whereas the differences between the ZV-E1 and the ZV-E10 Mark II is not double the price. It's within $1,000. So in my opinion, what would I do? I would save my pennies and go for the full frame ZV-E1 due to its low light capabilities, its IBIS, its reduced crops within different settings of the camera, its AI autofocus, because unfortunately the ZV-E10 Mark II, for whatever reason, didn't get the AI processing chip. I don't know why, but maybe it's to separate it between the A6700 because they are close in price point. I don't know. Personally, I think they should have just added it because it would have been more of a compelling choice for me if I were to be looking at another camera body for a D cam. But I would save my money and get this camera here. It's never let me down. It's got the full frame capabilities, amazing in low light. Yes, the ZV-E10 Mark II has low light capabilities, but it's never going to be as good as this one, being that shares the same sensor as the FX30 and A6700, and this shares the sensor of the FX3 and A7S3. I hope you liked this video. It's a bit of a rush one. I needed to get all my notes together so I can release this within the 12 hours of the camera being announced, but I hope it helps you in whatever you determine to purchase if you are looking for a vlog camera. Again, I'm not comparing it to its APS-C brothers. I'm comparing it to the vlog selection. So being that they are the two top of the line vlogging cameras in the APS-C and in the full frame, it felt right to compare the two. If you do like these type of videos, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. I'm only starting, so it's very, budging my way up and getting more and more views, but please comment down below what you'd like to see and hopefully I can get around to doing it. In the meantime, I am the Shy Camera Guy. Hope I see you in the next video. Until then, have a great one.